Joining us now, Leon Panetta, former defense secretary and former CIA director in the Obama administration. It's always great to have you with us. Much to discuss today, starting with this ouster of Navy Secretary John Phelan on top of a string of other high-profile exits. How unusual are these moves in the middle of a war?
Well, that's a great concern, because the last thing you want is to have the Department of Defense in turmoil during a war, when you've got to focus on what happens with Iran and not, frankly, what's happening with different personnel within the department itself. But I think the problem is that the secretary is continuing to do a war on culture and issues like woke and what have you, when he really ought to be focusing on the war in Iran and focusing on trying to maintain a real team that can work together in dealing with the very tough military issues that he's got to confront. Turmoil, personnel turmoil, does not help. It can undermine the ability to really operate that department.
And there is so much happening in this war with Iran. Just this week, the president extending the ceasefire indefinitely, but no additional talks scheduled. Iran attacking 3 ships in the Strait of Hormuz and seizing 2, calling it retaliation for the American blockade of its ports. And now we're learning the U.S. says it seized another tanker associated with Iran, but this time it was in the Indian Ocean. Does this sound like a resolution could happen soon, or is this only going to keep escalating?
It's hard not to come to the conclusion that these talks are stalled, and they're stalled because both sides are jockeying for position and waiting for the other side to blink. Iran's going after ships. The U.S. is going after ships. The reality is that this battle of trying to position each country for possible talks can really escalate and can get out of control, because if one country oversteps, the other country is going to respond. The other problem here is, frankly, it's going to be very tough for either side to go to the table if the Straits of Hormuz are closed. And the fact is that the United States has a blockade on top of a blockade, and that's guaranteeing that fuel is not going through the Straits of Hormuz. And what does that mean? It means higher prices for Americans. It means more economic turmoil in the world. And ultimately, I don't think that the United States can withstand not opening up the Straits of Hormuz.
In fact, our David Rohde and Julia Jester spoke to a group of experts, and most of them said Iran's economy could endure more economic pain than the U.S. economy. And that's in part because they're not a democracy. They don't answer to the population. And they've tried to make their economy less reliant on imports after so many years of sanctions. How do you negotiate with a regime that has that posture?
Well, that's the challenge. In many ways, the president's boxed in. He's dealing. I mean, the initial objective was to change the regime. The president said that the night of the attack. That didn't happen. It failed. And the reality is that we now have a regime that is much tougher and much more entrenched. And they are going to feel like they've survived both the attacks from the United States and Israel, and that in many ways they have nothing to lose by being even tougher. That's a problem. That's a problem, because the president doesn't have a choice here. He has got to deal with the regime in Iran, and that's not easy to do. Secondly, he's got the Straits of Hormuz problem. He's got to be able to open up the straits if he's going to, frankly, remove the gun from his head. Right now, the Iranians have a gun to the head of the United States, and it's called blocking the Straits of Hormuz. And lastly, I know the president is always threatening that, he'll attack here, he'll attack there, he'll go back to war. The reality is that this country is tired of war. America's tired of war. The Congress is tired of war. And the Congress may very well push a war powers resolution through that could really put limits on the president's ability. So he's facing all of those issues right now and struggling to try to ultimately get back to the negotiating table. That's a real challenge, and it makes for a real problem for the United States.
The president touched on some of the direct challenges when it comes to getting back to the negotiating table. Just this morning, he said on social media that Iran, quote, is having a very hard time figuring out who their leader is. They just don't know. The infighting is between the hardliners, who have been losing badly on the battlefield, he says, and the moderates, who are not very moderate at all, but gaining respect, is crazy. That's a direct quote from the president's post this morning. And he says that's why the U.S. is sort of pausing negotiations until they figure out who they're dealing with. So I'm wondering, Mr. Secretary, now that this conflict has seemingly upended the power structure inside Iran, have U.S. officials had enough time to really know and understand who they're negotiating with? I'm wanting you to put your CIA hat back on.
Well, I think the intelligence has been pretty clear that that right now the regime is in power. The hardliners are in power. The regime has survived. It hasn't come down. Obviously, I'm sure they're facing internal issues as any regime would. But the bottom line here is that, the religious leaders are largely symbolic and relate to religious issues. It's the military. It's the IRGC. It's those hardliners who've always been around that are determining just exactly what happens right now. And yeah, they're probably having problems coordinating and working together and what have you. But the fact is they're operating, and they've been operating under very tough circumstances, and they've proved very agile, and they've proved that they can survive. I wouldn't mess around to try to wait and see whether they fall apart. I think they've got to deal with the regime as it is. They've got negotiators. We've been talking with those negotiators. Deal with the people you have to deal with now and bring this war to an end.
Former Defense Secretary and former CIA Director Leon Panetta, thank you so much for joining us.